Well, thank you everyone for joining us again for our winter study sessions. As you know, we've been going over, roughly going over Thich Nhat Hanh's The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching, and I seem to be going off of it quite a bit, but that's okay. So what we're going to do this evening is first we're going to start off by doing the chant again of verses reaffirming the vows. I will bring it up on the screen. And then following that, I'm going to ask you to join me in a very brief mindfulness exercise. This is something that was taught to me by, he was they called it at that time a Burmese monk, although he was actually Japanese. His name was Venerable Vimara, and I got to be friends with him when I was a minister in Toronto. And Venerable Vimara, who was originally born and raised in Japan, went down to what is now Myanmar, and he became a Burmese monk. And then he ended up in Toronto because his brother was a chef in Toronto. And so he ended up coming to Toronto. And he came to our temple in Toronto a number of times to share the Dharma. And being a Burmese monk, he was much more free, if you will. He was going to the Burmese temple as well, but he came to our temple, and I'll go through it's a very simple exercise, but we'll do it afterwards. But we'll start off with the chanting of the verses reaffirming the vows, and I'm just going to bring that up now. You should see it in your screen. Let's see. Can you see it on your screen okay? Yes, okay, good. And if you're not muted, please mute yourself. Otherwise, it comes out garbled for people when we have more than one person chanting at the same time. So we'll begin with this chanting. Namandabs, 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 namandabs. Namandabs. Should I not provide to all for countless kalpas to come, aid in times of suffering? May I not attain Buddhahood. I will reach enlightenment, but unless my Buddha name resounds throughout the universe, may I not attain Buddhahood. I will practice a noble path, wisely, mindfully, free of greed, seek to reach the supreme way, be a guide light to one and all. May my power shine great light to illumine and dispel the darkness of the three poisons, and save all from suffering. With eyes of wisdom I'll remove the darkness of ignorance. I will close all evil paths, open gates of highest good. When I attain Buddhahood, light will shine throughout all lands, light brighter than sun and moon, outshining all heavenly lights, giving my virtues to all, not forsaking anyone. I will proclaim the Dharma like the roar of a great lion, bowing before all Buddhas, steadfastly gaining virtues, with wisdom fulfilling my vows. I shall be a guide to all, like the wisdom of my teacher. May my wisdom also shine all throughout the universe, and illumine one and all. If I shall fulfill these vows, may all lands tremble with joy. From the heavens wondrous flowers rain down upon all the lands. The virtue of Amita's vow is shared equally by all, together attaining awakened mind. We are born in the land of peace. Namandaps, namandaps, namandaps. So the mindfulness exercise that I want you to join me in is the mindfulness on the body. So if you're able to, I'd like to ask you to stand up. You don't have to, you can do it sitting down, but I find it easier doing it standing up. And what we're going to do is contemplate. This is going to be mindfulness contemplation on the body. And what we do actually is we consciously think to ourselves about the different parts of the body. And we're going to go from the top of the head all the way down to the bottom of our feet. And then we're going to come back up again. So I will cue you as to what you should be thinking on. And you could just either close your eyes, or you can have your eyes open as well if you want to. But we're going to start off and we're going to start consciously thinking about that part of your body. So we'll start off now with the mindfulness exercise on the body. So I'd like you to begin by contemplating on the tip of your head. Now contemplate on your eyes. Now contemplate on your ears. Now contemplate on your nose. Now contemplate on your mouth. Now contemplate on your neck. Now contemplate on your shoulders. Now contemplate on your elbows. Now contemplate on your hands. Now contemplate on your elbows. Now contemplate on your shoulders. Now contemplate on your chest. Now contemplate on your stomach. Now contemplate on your pelvis. Now contemplate on your knees. Now contemplate on your ankles. Now contemplate on the soles of your feet. Now contemplate on the toes of your feet. Now contemplate on the soles of your feet. Now contemplate on the ankles of your feet. Now contemplate on the knees. Now contemplate on your pelvis. Now contemplate on your stomach. Now contemplate on your chest. Now contemplate on your shoulders. Now contemplate on your elbows. Now contemplate on your hands. Now contemplate on your elbows. Now contemplate on your shoulders. Now contemplate on your neck. Now contemplate on your mouth. Now contemplate on your nose. Now contemplate on your ears. Now contemplate on your eyes. Now contemplate on the top of your head. Thank you. Please be seated if you're standing. I will ask you at the end how this felt to you. It may have felt very strange to some of you. It may have felt very relaxing to some of you. I hope none of you have fallen asleep. Why I asked you to join me in this mindfulness exercise is that last week I had mentioned I'll be going on to the other parts of the other teachings that Thich Nhat Hanh had mentioned in his book. But I realized after last week's talk that I really didn't go into the details of the Eightfold Path, which I think is very important. And so I wanted to go into, not all of them in detail, but highlight some of the major points. And then also we'll talk about some of the other teachings as well. It comes out naturally in it. But when we view this, so I'm just going to pull up, share a screen with you so you can see what we are going over. And again, I will be sending this to you afterwards, so you don't have to take notes or memorize anything. But what I wanted to start off with the Eightfold Noble Path, and talking a little bit more in detail in certain aspects of it. Of course, I did talk a little bit about the first one, right view, is to have a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths, to understand the suffering, understand the cause of suffering, the transformation of suffering, and the path to the transformation. So right view is actually, even though we put it at the first, it often comes at the very end, because it is the awakening that one has. By going through the various actions, one can attain an understanding or awakening of what the Buddha was hoping that we would awaken to, which is a true understanding of the Four Noble Truths. But then in Thich Nhat Hanh's book, I can't remember if he had right thought or right mindfulness first, but he brings right mindfulness, even though traditionally often you'll see right mindfulness around the seventh one of the Eightfold Noble Paths when they put it in a list. He brings it up to the second, or I think it was the second one, because of the importance that he felt of it. And mindfulness is indeed a very important aspect of the Buddha's teachings. And he mentions in the book what we call the Discourse on the Four Establishments of Mindfulness. And this is actually quite interesting when we look at it. And first of all, he talks about that there are four, the Buddha talks about there are four objects for our mindfulness practice: our body, our feelings, our mind, and the objects of our mind. And he starts off by talking about what we call the establishment of mindfulness of the body. So the exercise we just did right now was one of those mindfulness of the body. Okay? There are other exercises you can do. We have a walking meditation that we do. When we do our walking meditation here at our temple, we recite the Nembutsu as we walk. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. That's one way of mindfulness. Another form, and again, this was also taught to me by this Venerable Vimala, is as we walk, we consciously think to ourselves, stepping, lifting, forward, down, lifting. And that's the motions of the feet. So as you're walking, you consciously, mindfully think of your actions. So in this establishment of mindfulness of the body, in the book, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about mere recognition, just being observant of our actions as we move, as we do things. That's very important. I wish I could be more mindful because I'm often not. I tend to be a klutz at times. It really shows up on my golf game. The more mindful you are, probably the better swing I could have, but it doesn't work that way. But recognition, being mindful of your motions of your body. So that's the first of the establishment of mindfulness of the body. Okay, recognizing this. This next one was the recognition of one's body parts, and that's what the exercise we did today. So you start from the top of your head, and you systematically go down. And you could do it much longer than we did today if you wish. You could stay on one place much longer, or you could do it as quickly as we did today. What's interesting is they have found some Buddhist monks who are actually able to self-diagnose some of their ailments by doing this. When they go through their rituals, they're able to see where their body is ailing, if you will, because they're mindful, they're in tune with their body. And in fact, being mindful is a very important aspect of Buddhist practice. I think I've mentioned before about some of the hard practices that they have in the various different schools. And there's one school, Japanese school, where Shinran Shonin, founder of our school, came from originally. It's called the Tendai School of Buddhism. And in there, some of the practices, physiologically, modern medicine would say it's almost impossible what these people are doing. But what they're able to do is they're able to be so mindful of their body that they actually are able to change their metabolism. So where we would need to breathe regularly, they basically can almost stop their breathing, where they're only breathing maybe once a minute or even less than that. But that all has to do with the controlling of their body. And it starts off with this mindfulness of recognizing the various body parts. Another form of mindfulness on the body, Thich Nhat Hanh says, is the recognition of the elements the body is made up of, the earth, water, fire, and air. So as you breathe in, you start thinking about these elements that Buddhism traditionally says our bodies are composed of. And so as one practices this mindfulness of the body, then one becomes more aware of the six organs, and it is corresponding sense perceptions. So of course, when we talk about organs, normally we talk about five: our eyes, ears, nose, tongue or mouth, and the sense of touch is usually, our skin, tactile senses. But in Buddhism, they also include the mind as one of the senses. So they call this the sixth of the sense. And these are the corresponding perceptions that you have with it. So with the eyes, you have sight, ears, hearing, nose, smell, tongue or mouth, taste, the skin, touch, and mind, consciousness. Okay? So these are all perceptions that go along with the six senses. Then from here, the next of the four establishments of mindfulness is mindfulness of the feelings. So what I should point out is that what the Buddha said was that all these things naturally happen. Like we see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, we are conscious. But there's a difference between doing things mindfully and just doing it. When we are really in tune, or when we're really mindful of each step or each process, it becomes different from just going through the daily routine. So with the mindfulness of these perceptions, then one gets into feelings, and you can be mindful of the various feelings that are associated with these perceptions. And with each perception, you're going to get different feelings such as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So you might see something that's very appealing to you and have pleasant feelings about it, or you might have negative or neutral, and that goes with each of the perceptions. And with that, once we start getting this feeling of either pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant, then you get mind processing. So we can be mindful of our mind, our thoughts, or mental formations happen when we like something or dislike something. So through our feelings towards the perceptions of the senses, mental formations arise. Okay. So if one perceives something as pleasant, we may begin to think about how we can either continue to have that pleasant feeling, or what we can do to regain that feeling, right? Being mindful about mental formation is very important, because what you are doing is being mindful about how your thoughts arise. And it also helps us in, staying away from harmful perceptions that can lead to negative mental formations. And so it wasn't in Thich Nhat Hanh's book, but at this point I started thinking about science in Buddhism, and in particular the mind. And do you all know what dopamine is? Some of you, most of you, yes and no. Well, dopamine is a hormone that's created, okay? And when it was first, or earlier on, they called dopamine the feel-good hormone, okay? Which is actually a misnomer, because it doesn't, we now call it more the flight or fright hormone. But what dopamine, how, so historically, it was, when it was studied, what happened was in the 1950s and 1960s. So in the 50s, there was a professor by the name of James Old, who took lab mice, and he stimulated a certain portion of the brain. And he noticed that through that stimulation, that he was able to have the mice do repeated activities, okay, like pressing a lever to get food type thing. And so subsequent to Professor Old, there was another clinical researcher. Let's see. And so this Professor Old saw that dopamine was somehow associated with, there was an increased level of dopamine when he stimulated the brains of the mice of the certain area. And so he figured that dopamine was involved. And then there was another researcher subsequently by the name of Roy Weiss, who found that there are people with clinical depression who had low levels of dopamine. So hence, they came up with a hypothesis called the anhedonia hypothesis. And what this was the fact that they thought that dopamine was directly linked with this feeling good sensation. Okay. But it has since been refuted, or they found out the true function of dopamine, which is in fact shown that it's not, it doesn't necessarily create a sense of feeling good, but what it does is it helps the body motivate to act when anticipating an outcome. If you want to see a really interesting, very short YouTube, there's a YouTube video by a Professor Robert Sapolsky on the role of dopamine. And what they showed, let me just pull this. Can you see this screen? Or is it too bright, does it show up that well? Anyways, there's a graph, if you will, okay, and there's a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and I've got written down here light, work, and reward, okay? So what they did in this experiment was first of all, they got a light and they turned on a light. And when they turned on the light, that was the cue for the mice to press a lever. And let's say they had to press it 10 times in a row, and then the food would come out. Okay? So if they felt that the dopamine was bringing the sense of feeling good, then the prediction would have been that the dopamine would increase when they got the reward, right? When they got the reward. Instead, what happened with the mice is that they found the dopamine level jumped up right at the beginning, and then it actually went down. So it was the anticipation. When the light went on, they were anticipating. They have to do the work, and then they'll get the reward. Okay? So instead of this dopamine working as a reward, it was at the beginning. What was really interesting, though, is when they did this test, and this was the curve that happened when there was 100% correlation. In other words, they gave a reward every single time the mice pressed the lever 10 times. This was the kind of graph that they came up with. It went up and then it came down. Okay, this is an amount of dopamine that's created in the body. However, they found something more interesting was when they only gave the mice rewards on 50% of the time. Instead of doing this, the graph just took off right off the charts. So instead of getting 100% reward, they were only getting rewarded 50% of the time, but the dopamine levels went right through the sky. And so what it meant was it was actually the anticipation or the fact that they may not get rewarded was creating sort of this extra adrenaline, if you will, in the thinking that, oh, today's my lucky day, I'm going to get it. And they got it, this off the chart record. But the funny thing about all this is, and psychologists have shown this, is that, in fact, we human beings are very similar. In fact, the one place that this really comes out is Las Vegas, right? If people got 100% of the time, it would be like this graph. But because, there's the odds are against you, but still, everybody goes to Las Vegas because just that feeling that, oh, today's my lucky day, or I'm going to beat the house, or whatever it is, right? And interestingly enough, in this YouTube video, Professor Robert Sapolsky also mentions the difference between humans and animals are, in fact, that humans can keep this level of dopamine high even when the reward is decades later. Okay, so this is why people can go to be motivated to get into a good university, to get a good job, etc., for the reward later down the road, right? In fact, he went to the extreme of saying that human beings are the only species that would even continue or look for rewards even after one has passed away. Right, going to heaven. If you do good, you go to heaven, right? So people try to do good while we're alive. But anyways, now what was I talking about? Dopamine. Okay. Oh yeah, so basically what it is that in Buddhism, what they're saying is by being mindful of our thoughts, we can, as I was mentioning here at the beginning, a little further up, is that it's our perception, being mindful of our perceptions. So if we are just caught up in the stimulus, we're like the rats or the mice who are stimulated, and we want to carry that feeling on further. So by being mindful of your feelings, you can prevent from being addicted to things, or it can help you. If you understand your thought process, it can help you. You realizing that what's happening when we go to Las Vegas, we're behaving exactly the same as lab mice. Doesn't mean that we'll stop going to Las Vegas, but at least we know the thought process that goes behind it. So being mindful of our thought process is also is one of the third of the four establishments is mindfulness of the mind. Also, when we talk about the mind, establishments of the mind, understanding mindfulness of the mind, we also think about another way that the Buddha talked about it is what we call the eight consciousness. Okay? And so how the Buddha defined the eight consciousness is that along in correspondence with the six sensory organs and the six sensory perceptions, there's also six what we call consciousness that are attached to that. So you can have a sight consciousness, you can have a hearing consciousness. So, you might hear there's a difference between hearing something and listening, right? So hearing is more of a passive, things are just coming into your ear. But when you listen, that's when there's actually a conscious process that's happened, right? So I'm sure, Jennifer, you probably talked to Nina or Henry and saying, "You're not listening to me," right? That happens to all of us, right?
Exactly.
Exactly, right. So there's a consciousness, a hearing, that's associated with each of these senses that we have. In fact, one of the strongest ones is the olfactory and the oral consciousness, right? So you probably you have heard people say, I just can't make the whatever the same way that grandma made, or that one taste of something could bring back floods of memory of childhood, for instance, right? So these are all consciousness that are attached with our sense organs, okay, and including the mind itself. There are our conscious mind, and that's associated with our thinking. So then, along with that, then there's what we call, so these are the first six. And the seventh one, so this is all has to do with if you want to call it the Buddhist psychology, there's a whole school of thoughtfulness or consciousness school of Buddhism. And this is all part of that consciousness school of Buddhism. And below our six consciousness, then there's what we call the subconscious, okay? Or in Buddhism, they call it the manas consciousness. The manas consciousness is still, it is the interlink between what we call our collective consciousness with our individual consciousness, okay? So what this is our consciousness, our rational mind, is actually affected by our subconscious. And that subconscious is an interplay of not only our present, but also our history, okay? So in other words, most all of you, or I'm assuming, I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm assuming that most of the people that joined my lecture today are people who are perhaps against Trumpism or the thought of what Trump stands for. Am I correct in assuming that? Maybe not. But there's a reason why you're against it. And it's not because of who you are, but it's because of your history, of who you've been raised, the family you've been raised with, the connections that you've had in the past create who you are today, create who I am today. And all that past experience, I will have an affinity for those things that agree with my consciousness. So even before I'm thinking it, I'm leaning towards that way, right? So, I naturally lean towards watching CNN over Fox News. Why? Because it's been part of my consciousness. So it's my subconscious that is leading or at the base of my consciousness. But that subconsciousness is still identifying myself as being different from others, okay? So it's still part of what we call our delusional mind, if you will. But even below the subconscious, and this is where it gets really almost funky, if you will, is what we call the alaya vijnana consciousness, or in Japanese we call it arayashiki, the store consciousness or the seed consciousness. And this is actually a collective consciousness. This is saying that every single experience that we have as individuals, as well as a sentient being, that all gets put into this, what we call storehouse. So everything gets put in there, and that becomes the potential energy for the future. So the way I like to explain it is the DNA of our consciousness. So it's like our DNA of our beings has the potentiality to express itself in many different ways. And all of us are unique because of the way our DNA has expressed itself. And similarly, with the consciousness, all of our thoughts, everything that happens is because of what they call this storehouse consciousness. Everything that we can think of, or every thought that we can have, is partially it's because of what's in the storehouse. So how it differs is how that seed is nurtured or brought about. Okay, so if you have this goes back to my last talk about the nutriments, right? If you have positive nutriments, there's going to be positive things that come out from the storehouse. Conversely, if you have toxins, you're going to have negative consciousness that comes out of this storehouse. Okay, so one of the things that they talk about in the teachings is you can become mindful of these various levels of consciousness. And the Buddha compared this to the wave in the ocean, that you can, the wave can actually acknowledge that they are part of the ocean, or they can be mindful of the fact. It doesn't negate the wave, it doesn't take away from the wave, but it also acknowledges that there's something deeper. So this is one of the, when they talk about the third mindfulness of the mind, this is one of the ways of explaining that the Buddha did, was this eight levels of consciousness. And there were schools that strictly adhered to just their whole school is on the consciousness, understanding these eight consciousness that exist. And then the fourth establishment of mindfulness is establishment of the object of our minds. So what they're saying is that in order for consciousness or a process to happen, we actually have to acknowledge that the object is there as well. Without the object, we couldn't think about anything. So it's showing the relativity of our consciousness, is that we still need an object or subject to think about, right? So without the blue sky, you can't think about a blue sky, literally, right? It gets very, very philosophical here when we start thinking about things like this. But basically, the whole idea is that the object is also part of our mind. It is our perception of what we think we're seeing. And so this is one of the four elements of establishing mindfulness is mindfulness of the object. However, and it's not written in Thich Nhat Hanh's book per se, but there is another way of mindfulness, and that's in our particular tradition, the Pure Land tradition. And that approach is to be contemplating on the Buddha itself. Okay, and what this means is that, well, as you could tell by the explanation that I gave you, this can become quite involved intellectually to understand all of this, all the various levels of mind, etc., and you know, I'm sure some of you were getting quite confused at some portions of reading this book, because it gets very, very in-depth about these various aspects. But there is another one, and that is contemplating on the Buddha. And in Japanese, we say Nembutsu, or in Chinese, they'll say Nianfo. Okay. And when we look at this word nembutsu, nen, this character nen, to think of or to be mindful of, this is made up of two parts. You have an upper half that looks like this, and we pronounce this as ima. And then the bottom half, which looks like this, we call it kokoro. Kokoro actually comes from a diagram of a heart. It's supposed to be 4 chambers, right? So this is where this comes from. But kokoro means the heart or the mind or the center of being. So when you put now, the nen means now, plus heart and mind, and then butsu means Buddha. So when we say nembutsu, literally we're saying the Buddha now heart, or the Buddha in my heart at this moment. Okay. So originally when they said Nianfo or Nembutsu, that was actually being mindful of the Buddha. Okay. It wasn't necessarily reciting the name of the Buddha. The association of Nembutsu and recitation of the name, that actually comes about much later by the monk Shantao, Zendo Daishi, one of the 7 patriarchs. He says Nembutsu is actually the recitation of the name. But originally, Nembutsu literally means thinking on the Buddha or mindful of the Buddha. Okay, so being mindful of the Buddha makes us, it can transcend our daily thoughts. In our understanding is that being mindful of the Buddha means to awaken to the working of the Dharma. And so it's listening actually to the Dharma, and we become mindful of it. And I'll get into that more later. I didn't want to concentrate too much on that. But so that was the right mindfulness. And through this right process of right mindfulness, we can have right thought, which is the speech of the mind. Right thinking is the base of what we call the 3 karmic actions. So traditionally in Buddhism, the word karma, karma can actually mean, has several different meanings. In the Hindu religion, when they talk about karma, they often associate it with duty. So karma is like duty. But when we talk about karma in Buddhism, karma is literally action with volition. And so karma itself is neither good nor bad. You can have positive results or negative results through your actions, but the actual action itself is neither good nor bad. But in Buddhism, traditionally, they look at karma and they break it down into 3 parts. So that's our mind, our speech, and our actions, bodily actions. Okay. And interestingly enough, in our modern society, our physical action and our speech can be or are prosecuted against or have a heavier consequence, if you will, than our actual thoughts. So, if you physically abuse somebody, you will get charged. If you say bad things, you can get charged for slander, right? But if you have bad thoughts, it's very hard to prosecute, right? Because unless you express that. But in Buddhism, the thought is the most important, okay? Because the thought leads to the others, right? If you don't have that thought and you do something, we call that an accident. And accidents happen to everybody. But if you actually have a willful thought, like breaking into the Capitol building, that is actually, a crime, right? The thought has to be there. They didn't accidentally go into that building, right? So thought is very important, and thought can be broken down into two parts: what we call our initial thought, and then what's also then from there you get a developing thought. And the initial thought is very important in Buddhism because that can differentiate where you're going to go. Okay, so when I was going to school in Buddhism in Japan many years ago, I went to a Buddhist seminary school called Chuo Bukkyo Gakuin, or the Central Buddhist Academy. And on the first day of our school day, in the front of the school is sort of like a bulletin board. And it was written these words here: Shoshin wasuru bekarazu, or never forget the initial heart or mind. So when we're going through things, often we might have the initial mind to help. If we're inspired by somebody and we have the mind to help, but we can often forget or lose sight of that initial mind, and that's when we can go awry in our actions. So this poem, which it was written by a Buddhist poet by the name of Mitsuo Aida is his last name, very famous, more leaning towards Zen thoughts, but he became very popular within the last 20 years. He's passed away now, but this poem here, I'm just going to read the Japanese and then the English translation is: 人間を動かし人間を変えていくものは難しい理論や理屈じゃないんだな。感動が人間を動かし、出会いが人間を変えていくんだな。Which means, so this is called encountering and to be in awe. People are not moved nor changed by difficult reasoning or rationalization. People are moved when they are inspired. Encountering inspiration is what causes the change. Right? So when we think about it, that initial thought, if it's coming from a place of inspiration, in other words, for the good of all of mankind or for the benefit of others, then that will often inspire one to move or to have positive reaction to that. And so that initial mind is very important in a Buddhist thought process. Okay, so right thinking. And then if we have the right thinking, then that then develops into this right speech. This actually is the quote directly from Thich Nhat Hanh's book. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I am committed to cultivating loving speech and deep listening in order to bring joy and happiness to others and relieve others of their suffering. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am determined to speak truthfully with words that inspire self-confidence, joy, and hope. I will not spread news that I do not know to be certain, and will not criticize or condemn things of which I am not sure. I will refrain from uttering words that can cause division or discord, or that can cause the family or the community to break. I am determined to make all efforts to reconcile and resolve all conflicts, however small. In fact, this is one of the precepts that one of the what we call the 5 evils of Buddhism includes causing disharmony within the Sangha. And so here, our speech can cause disharmony. But what's interesting, what he didn't mention here is that idle speech is also considered unwholesome. So even just idle chit-chat can be considered unwholesome. So for me to go on about Trump is also unwholesome. So I should forget about that. I should let it go. Right? And then that, of course, our speech and our thoughts, our mindfulness leads to our actions, how we behave. Right? So when they talk about the three aspects of karma, the thought, the speech, and the action, they have to be in tune with one another. Otherwise, it doesn't manifest itself. Okay. So sorry for going back to this again, but the typical image you might have is the crooked politician, where they say one thing and they do something completely different, right? Never mind Trump. That was just an example. Sorry to go back to that. But that creates right action and livelihood. This is a very interesting one, like right livelihood, because the Buddha actually talks about engaging in livelihood that doesn't harm other beings. And yet, we know this is not just the individual that's doing that itself, as Thich Nhat Hanh puts out in the book. You don't just blame the butcher who kills the cow. It's the people that demand the butcher to kill the cow is also just as responsible for that. So our livelihood, when we think about it in that way, the interconnectedness that we have with our whole world, actually, everything that we do affects everything else. And so when we talk about right livelihood, one doesn't get on a pedestal thinking, I'm this wonderful person, and then go down to McDonald's and have the Big Mac and think, well, I'm okay. That being said, so in our Pure Land School of Buddhism, it actually recognizes that depending on our karmic situation, depending on the situation of our life, we will do many different forms of livelihood. And it actually recognizes those activities. We don't say that the fisherman or the butcher, that they are evil or they're doing something bad. We understand they're taking life, but we also understand we all take life in order for us to exist. And so what we do with that life we take is considered very important. So, but that's Jodo Shinshu, and I'll get into that again later. And then right effort, and knowing what, how to have the right effort to promote these Eightfold Path, and then right concentration or practicing of samadhi, meditation. So these are basically an overview of the Eightfold Noble Path, especially with the emphasis on the mindfulness, which was a very big part of especially Thich Nhat Hanh being of the Zen or the Chan school of Buddhism, where mindfulness is paramount. This is why he emphasized it in his book as such. I was going to talk about, and we briefly talked about it already, but it comes out independently in the book, the 3 Dharma Seals, but I'll leave that for next week. And what I'd like to do, so I give you a little bit of warning or forewarning, is next week, I'd like to just tie up the final or some of the other teachings, and then I'm going to have a break for a little while. What I'm going to do, as I mentioned last week, is I wanted to tie in how Jodo Shinshu teachings and the basic tenets of Buddhism come together with one another. But what I'd like to do is have a little bit of a break to prepare for that. So have one more session next week to finish up some of the loose ends of this book. If you have any questions, please feel free to either ask me or contact me. I'll try to have some time next week where we can talk about some questions you may have. And I'm going to send this, what I presented to you this evening, I'll send it out to you for your reference. And I think that is all that I have to say for this evening. So I'm going to just stop sharing here at this moment and